In this video, we'll continue to look at Paul's first missionary journey, primarily centered in Acts 13 and 14. In this video, Acts 14, though in the next video, we'll look at Acts 15 as well, as we look at the principles and process found in the four fields from Mark 4, verses 26 to 29 throughout the passage. Briefly, the four fields from Mark 4, verses 26 to 29 tells us the kingdom principle in which a farmer enters new fields, which we find the principle of entry. Gospel is shared, or the seed begins to be sown. That seed begins to grow as disciples are formed from the seed that's been scattered. And then that seed is gathered together for as the harvest is ready. And we find here the expression of church. And finally, leaders are raised up to enter into new fields, and a cycle forms from season to season. So take some time and read through Acts 14 with the four fields in mind, including entry, gospel, discipleship, gathering, leaders, and abiding, in which we get God's heart to enter new fields. Okay, so let's begin to look at this together, beginning in verse 1, in which Paul and Barnabas enter Iconium, so that's entry, and then they begin to share in the Jewish synagogue. So we can include that in the gospel field as well for verse 1. We see Paul and Barnabas experiencing some persecution as the Jews and the Gentiles begin to push back against them. We see them speaking with greater boldness, and then that message being confirmed with demonstration through signs and wonders being performed. So let's include that here in the gospel field with signs and wonders, verse 3. Paul and Barnabas find out about a plot to stone them, so they move on, and we find them entering into Lystra and Derbe. So let's put that in the entry field. And there in Lystra, we find them continuing to preach the gospel. So we include this in the gospel field for verse 7, preaching at Lystra. There in Lystra, there's a man who's lame, and we find Paul seeing this man's faith. And so here is this evidence of abiding in verse 9. And having seen his faith, Paul then demonstrates this gospel as the man who is lame gets up and begins to walk. So we see a sign and a wonder and a demonstration of the gospel. This demonstration of the gospel is misinterpreted by the people who see it, and so Paul and Barnabas stand up and continue to preach with greater clarity and boldness, and we find this in verse 15 to 18 as they try to bring understanding to what they have just seen with the preaching of the gospel. So include that in the gospel field. More persecution as Paul is stoned and dragged outside the city, thought for dead. But we find in verse 20 that the disciples gather around him, and he gets up and goes on to the next city. So now he and Barnabas are going on to Derbe. So here we can include this in the entry field. In verse 21, it says they preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. So we can include this here in the gospel field. And because it's articulated this is more than just salvation, but disciples being added, let's also include this in the discipleship field, or field 3. Then they return to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. And in verse 22, they're strengthening the disciples in these places and encouraging them with the testimony of their own persecution to remain true to their faith. So it's an example of discipleship here in field 3 from verse 22 in Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, as they're exhorting them through the place of testimony and their own story of what happened to them. And so let's also include this in the gather field, or field 4, because they are gathering together with these disciples in this process. So moving on to the next verse, in verse 23, we continue on as Paul and Barnabas further establish these churches, and it says here that they appointed elders for them in each church. So here we are in the leadership field with the appointing of elders, and it goes on to say, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. So we see here an example of abiding as they fasted and prayed for the appointing of these elders in these churches. We then have another example of entry, as in verse 24, it says, going through Pisidia, they came into Pamphylia. So entry into Pamphylia, verse 24. And we then have an example here of entry into Italia. And before that, they preached the word in Perga. So we have here both an example of field 1 of entry and field 2 in which the preaching of the gospel happened in Perga, verse 25. We round out this chapter with gathering or regathering with the church at Antioch. So we have here in verse 26 to 28, the team returning to Antioch, and upon arriving, they gathered with the church, and they reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So this is also an example of discipleship through testimony. So we could include this in the discipleship field as well. So that wraps up our study of Acts 14 and Paul's first missionary journey. And it's interesting because in verse 22, it really summarizes up what this portion really is all about, where Paul says we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. So this is a lot of pushback in field 1 and 2 as they're entering and sharing the gospel a lot, seeing some discipleship happen, some gathering and some raising up of elders, but a lot of going in this first missionary journey.